Well, I must say that you people are gluttons for punishment. To have a lunch like the one we've just had, and then to be prepared to listen to a lecture, which is quite likely to be very boring, is very generous of you. I know this is a faithful remnant, but all the more valuable for that. Thank you for staying on. Well, I think Bishop Ray's mention of the Reformation is actually as good a point to jump off as any, because we have been seeing in these last lectures how the Anglican tradition, particularly in the Church of England, developed over the years. And when we came to the Reformation, I think we would have to say, and this includes the Anglican Reformation, that it was, as these pamphlets say, a tragic necessity. We wish that it didn't have to happen, but it did need to happen because the church needed to renew itself, to reform itself. So in that sense, it is a blessing. And we noted the other day that one of the things about the Reformation as a whole, the Reformation churches, all of them, as well as the Church of England and its experience of reform, one of the features was an absence of a need to engage in world mission. The Counter-Reformation had it, for better or for worse, but the churches of the Reform at the time of the Reform did not have it. And there are all sorts of positive and negative reasons given for this. The positive reason that Dr. Ashley Null gives, I'm sure you're familiar with him, is that the reformers were concerned to disciple their own nation. That is where their energies were focused. Other reasons that are given are things like not having control over the seas, because the Roman Catholic powers and to some extent the Turks had control over the seas still, so people could not travel easily in terms of world mission. But whatever reasons may be given, there is not even an expression of regret in these churches because of this absence. I mean, there are notable exceptions, as we noted, Adrian Saravia from Holland being one of them, but generally there is an absence. Let's put it like that. So the question is, if the Church of England did not have this concern for the worldwide mission of the church, how is there an Anglican communion? You know, that's the question. And the question can be answered in many different ways. I think there are three main reasons for there being an Anglican communion today. So the first is what I call the coincidental spread of Anglicanism. I mean, coincidental, not in the sense of it being an accident, but of coinciding with the spread of English-speaking peoples to different parts of the world, including, of course, here. And when they went to different parts of the world, in Africa or Asia or in the Americas, they naturally enough took their church with them. And they tried, on the whole, to make their church look as much like home as it was possible for them to do so, given the differences in climate and polity and so on. From quite an early period, there emerged people in the Church of England who wanted to support this coincidental spread of Anglicanism. So the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, SPCK, and also the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel came into existence at that time for these reasons, to support the settlers when they went abroad and as they lived abroad in this task of establishing and developing their churches. So their main concern was with those who had gone. from the motherland, if you like. But they were faithful Christian people, and they knew that this wasn't going to be enough. So some of their better chaplains and their better officials tried also to work with the indigenous peoples to wherever the settlers had gone. This is reflected, for instance, in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, in the provision of a service for adult baptism, where it says that this format has been provided for Anabaptists who may see the light, as it were, and also it may be profitable for the natives in our plantations, the rubric says. So there was a consciousness that it couldn't just be limited to the settlers, it had to be more than that. Bishop Stephen Neale, in his magisterial book, The History of Christian Mission, says that although there was this provision in the prayer book, in the 17th century there was only one Indian, as it were, from Indian from India, not Indian from here, is recorded as having been baptized according to Anglican rites. But the provision was there. And you know that in the settlement of Jamestown, the settlers were supported from England in the establishing of their church, but the conversion of Pocahontas and the fact that she was a missionary to her own people is something that is not widely known. I mean, Pocahontas' name in England is very popular. But everyone knows her as an Indian princess from America, but not as a missionary to her own people. We had a wonderful marking of the anniversary of the settlement of Jamestown, the 400th, I think it was, in the church in Gravesend, which was in my diocese, from where the settlers went. And the people from Jamestown all came over. And I was, of course, as the bishop, invited to be there, and I was thinking, gosh, this is going to be a very boring civic service with mayors and maces and all of those things. And that's how it began. But in the middle of it all, the Indians who had come from here took over the service. I don't know quite how it happened. And they were witnessing to these rather reserved English mayors and so on, all dressed up. And they said, we want to pray for your children, you pray for our children, and all this. I mean, the whole thing was an event of the Holy Spirit, I think. But it showed how things had happened over the centuries. Now, so there was this coincidental spread of Anglicanism, which is still recognizable in many parts of the world, including in this country. The second was the evangelical spread. That is to say, with the evangelical revival, the preaching of Wesley and Whitefield, people were reading their Bibles and discovering that they had a responsibility to bear witness to the gospel in different parts of the world. And their social responsibility, their reform of many abusive practices in Britain itself, their campaign against the slave trade, and this recognition of an obligation to world mission all went together with the Clapham sect, for instance, but not only them. When the Church Missionary Society was established in 1799, they wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury asking for his blessing. It took him 2 years to reply to their letter, but they didn't wait for him. They went ahead with what God was asking them to do. And there were all sorts of obstacles. I mean, for instance, the East India Company, which ruled India at that time, prohibited Christian mission on its territory. One of Wilberforce's great campaigns was to force the East India Company to allow missionaries. into its territory. And this is often the case. I mean, very often these days in sort of secular history courses and so on, we find that Christian mission and colonialism are somehow identified. Now, in some cases they were, but in many cases there was hostility and tension and outright conflict. So the East India Company did not allow Christian missionaries. The British in Nigeria did not allow missionary work in the north, which is why the north is predominantly Muslim today, and a lot of Nigeria's problems relate to that. In the Caribbean, the Anglican missionaries often stood up against slavery, and that was another area of conflict between the church and the government of the day, the rulers of that time. So when the CMS began its work, it had to begin its work in India in a native princely state called Travancore with the ancient church of St. Thomas. And from the very beginning, CMS was committed to not making these people Anglican, but renewing their life by translating the Bible, helping them with theological education and so on. As a matter of fact, in the end, an Anglican church did emerge, but that had not been the intention. CMS was the first Anglican organization set up with the intention of world mission. So that world mission was no longer something done on the side, if you were interested, but that was the main reason for its existence. And many provinces of the Anglican Communion, the biggest provinces of the Anglican Communion, the most orthodox provinces of the Anglican Communion today have arisen from that work. So we praise God for it. The 19th century missionaries were people of their time. Sometimes they were racist, sometimes they were arrogant, sometimes they were mistaken, but we cannot forget what they did. When they went, for example, to West Africa, many of them took their coffins with them because they knew they were not coming back. The disease gradient was so high and the resistance of Europeans to West African diseases was so low that many young people and even the children died and are buried in the mission fields to which they went. And it's easy to criticize, but harder to salute such people. But we must do so. So the evangelical spread was the second kind. And then the third was the Catholic expansion. So David Livingstone's speech in the Senate in Cambridge, where he called for commerce and Christianity, that is often derided by secular historians, but when he meant commerce, he meant instead of slavery. You know, that's what he meant, that the slave trade should be replaced by honest commerce and by Christianity. Now his cry, David Livingstone was not an Anglican, he was a Congregationalist, but his cry was taken up by the Anglo-Catholic revival and the establishing, first of all, of the university's mission to Central Africa. Eventually, the SPG, which had already been a high church society in the old sense, also became Catholic, more Catholic in its orientation, and that is how the Catholic aspect of Anglicanism spread, for instance, to provinces like Southern Africa, but many other places also. So this is how Anglicanism emerged as a world church, if you like, a fellowship of churches throughout the world. Now, of course, there were tensions in this. You know, the colonial churches very often were sniffy about the missionary churches. The evangelicals and the Catholics, well, sometimes they got on, but sometimes they didn't. So SPG and CMS, you can read the history in one way as a history of conflict, and in another way as a history of cooperation. So when provinces and dioceses began to be formed, sometimes you had all these traditions in the same place. In India, for instance, you had the ecclesiastical department of the government of India, which was official Anglicanism. Crown bishops, crown chaplaincies, huge churches that no one can now maintain, all of these things. Then you had CMS with its evangelical view of the church, and then you had SPG with its Catholic emphasis. And all of these people had to be brought together. It's not easy. In Tanzania, half the country was evangelized by the university's mission to Central Africa, and the other half, not by CMS, but by BCMS, the Bible Churchmen's Missionary Society, a very evangelical society. And when the first prayer book had to be written for the province and all of these things, it was a very interesting time. Now, because of all of these reasons, there arose a need for Anglican leaders, for Anglican bishops, to come together. And the bishops of Southern Africa, of the United States, of Canada, petitioned the Archbishop of Canterbury in the mid-19th century to call together a general synod of Anglicans. That's what they asked for, a general synod of Anglicans. Well, the Archbishop of Canterbury was advised immediately by his lawyers that this could go against the royal supremacy, because a general synod might do things that the established Church of England didn't wish to do or wasn't allowed to do. The evangelicals in the Church of England were also worried that such a general synod would be too influenced by the Catholic party and might compromise the reformed formularies of the Church of England. So this is why he was not allowed to call a general synod. What he did call in the end was the Lambeth Conference, which was not a synod, which was not decision-making, which was a body for prayer and consultation amongst the bishops. Now, this shows us a number of things. First of all, the gathering role of the Archbishop of Canterbury began to emerge. Someone who called the communion together in different ways at different times for different reasons. The other was this regular meeting of bishops as it emerged as the Lambeth Conference, meeting roughly every 10 years or so. And although it did not have any legal status and could not make legally binding decisions, it did become a source of some very good teaching for Anglicans and a place where some decisions were made that, if not legally binding, were morally authoritative. That's the point. So successive conferences, the 1888 conference adopted the American Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, as it came to be called, as a way of approaching other churches about unity. The appeal to all Christian people triggered the ecumenical movement in many ways. There was teaching on the family, on contraception, and all sorts of things that the Lambeth bishops taught from one decade to another. 10 years was a long time to wait for another Lambeth conference, so a body was set up called the Lambeth Consultative Body of bishops from every province who would meet every other year or so to transact any business that came up in between the meetings of the Lambeth Conference. And then in 1948, a need was felt to set up a missionary strategy council. Now, the reasons I mentioned all these obscure bodies is that they all crystallized into something that you will recognize. So the Lambeth Consultative Body is actually what became the Primates Meeting. See, thereby hangs a tale, doesn't it? And the Missionary Strategy Council became the Anglican Consultative Council. So that is how what we call the instruments for unity in the Anglican Communion emerged. Now, the point is that because of the pressure of theological and moral revisionism, you are all familiar with this, I don't want to repeat everything that has happened and is still happening. Because of that, the instruments began to fail one by one. Yeah? So the Archbishop of Canterbury has been used to calling the Lambeth conferences. The 1988 conference, Bishop Keith was at it, he admitted. I was the coordinator for it under Archbishop Robert Runcie. All these conferences were successfully called and successfully deliberated and taught and made certain decisions, good or bad, for the sake and on behalf of the communion. And that's fine. When it came to the 2008 conference, more than 300 bishops regretfully declined the Archbishop of Canterbury's invitation to come to the Lambeth conference. That included me as well. I didn't know when I declined that 300 other people would join me. But that's how it happened. And why did they decline? Well, I'll tell you why I declined. I declined because 50 or so bishops who had laid hands on a person in an actively homophile relationship to make him a bishop were also invited. And I did not feel that without any expression of repentance on their part, that I could join with them in a common council for teaching the Christian faith and for expressing my fellowship with them. I expect that the other 300 or so bishops who also declined did so for similar reasons. Anyway, many of us, or nearly all of us, found ourselves at the first GAFCON in Jerusalem, and that was a great time. I arrived late for it because I'd had ordinations in my diocese, and when I arrived, I found Anglo-Catholics, Evangelicals, and Charismatics all worshipping God together in Jerusalem, studying the Bible together. And I thought to myself, why can the Anglican Communion not be like this? What is the reason? Anyway, the point to make is that that first instrument of communion failed to gather, and also the Lambeth conferences that had been making these decisions and providing moral teaching. In 2008, the conference was so structured that it could not make any decision and it could not teach. It was structured like an Indaba group, which is about talking the hind legs of a donkey, basically, if that's not putting it too rudely. So that instrument has also failed, the Lambeth Conference. The Primates meeting continued for a while, and the Primates were given solemn promises that certain things would happen or not happen, and when they returned home, they found that the promises had already been broken. So Bible-believing Orthodox Primates decided it was a waste of time to go to these meetings. So another instrument became ineffective. The same thing happened with the ACC. So the point is that all four instruments became inoperative and ineffective. So what to do? How is the Anglican Communion to be held together? I mean, this is still a question that we face. GAFCON, two GAFCONs have happened. There are You've got the Anglican Church in North America now. We praise God for that, in spite of all the difficulties that there are. But this is work unfinished, incomplete. The ecclesial nature of what is going to be in the future is not completely clear, as I'm sure you all realize, and I certainly realize. And what should we do towards clarity? I think that's the question that I want to address this afternoon. One of the features of the Anglican Reformation, uniquely, is that the Anglican reformers managed to uphold both the sacred deposit of faith, that is to say, the Holy Scriptures, and a continuity in the sacred ministry. You see, this is unique in the churches that have been influenced by the Reformation. Now, this is not to say that the sacred deposit of faith, that is to say the Scriptures and the sacred ministry, are on the same level. Such is not the case, because the ministers are simply servants and stewards of the word, and by no means its masters. I mean, that should be quite clear. But if apostolic succession, for instance, is to be understood as a succession that is continuous historically, it must also be understood as a succession in fidelity to the faith. I mean, both of these features need to be held very closely together. But Anglicanism has managed to do this, and I think there is a providential aspect to this, because it could easily have been lost. In the course of the Reformation itself, in the period of the Commonwealth, in the next century, and at other times. But it was not lost. It was preserved by God's gracious providence, and I think important for us as we seek to understand our church, our fellowship of churches, in a new way. And this point must always be kept in mind. But as we seek to restructure, to reconstruct, I suppose, to renew, to reform, a prominent Roman Catholic theologian said to me the other day that since the Second Vatican Council, they think of their church as Ecclesia Semper Reformanda. And I said, well, yes, that's a good Reformation principle. Yeah. And we shouldn't neglect it either. You know, the church that is always reforming. There's nothing strange about that. So as we think of this renewal and reform and reconstruction, what should we be thinking about? Again, gathering is very important. You know, this is why conferences like this are so important. This is why synods of the church are very important. Christians who want to be faithful to the whole of the apostolic tradition need from time to come together. Certainly those who have teaching responsibility in the church, sacramental responsibility in the church, preaching responsibility, pastoring, they need from time to be gathered. And there needs to be an effective way of gathering. So if the instruments have failed, what are the effective ways of gathering? Secondly, when we gather together, we have to gather in a way that is an evangelical way, a gospel way. So many of our synods, certainly in the Church of England, I have long weary experience of this, the synods are constructed on the parliamentary model. You know, motions and resolutions and amendments and papers and, well, you know the story. Well, maybe they are necessary, but the word synod, what does the word synod mean? It means walking in the same way. And which way is that? Well, it could be the Anglican way, but behind the Anglican, truly Anglican way is what? I am the way, the truth, and the life, said Jesus. It is walking in the way of the Lord. Otherwise, it's nothing. Parliamentary procedures may be pristine. Lawyers may be hugely influential. Well, they always are if they're around, in my experience. But if we are not walking in the way of the Lord, it's all futile. That's my experience. So the gathering must be synodal in that sense, of walking in the way of the Lord. And then it must be a gathering for praying. Not just passing resolutions, not just listening to learned papers, but praying together. Praying together, not just on our own, but together as a church. How effective that prayer is when we come across all of God's people praying together. And then not just praying together, but praising together. So synodality must be properly Eucharistic in that sense. Properly Eucharistic. A place of praise for what God is doing in His church and in His world. Not on the margins, not as a nod at the beginning of something and in the end of something, but absolutely in the center of all that we do. So the gathering is for the purpose of prayer and praise. That is what a properly Eucharistic assembly should mean. Not hiving off to do something in a corner, which sometimes, I'm afraid, it did become. Gathering, praying, praising, consulting, of course. Talking to one another about the issues that each is facing, learning from one another, being encouraged by one another, and being restrained for the sake of the gospel. I mean, one of the most difficult things that I found over 2 Lambeth conferences with the Episcopal Church was that they came to the conferences and said, we are going to do such and such, whatever you say. Whatever you say. And that included the Archbishop of Canterbury, all the other bishops of the Anglican Communion, etc., etc. Well, that is not consultation, is it? And then, yes, there has to be sometimes definitive teaching about the nature of marriage, for instance, or what the church says based on the Bible about the human person, about human relationships generally, about whether there can be a just war. I mean, all of these things that you've been doing in your workshops. The church has from time to time to say something that is seen as authoritative by the faithful and even by those outside the church. So we can't duck decision making by having perpetual indaba. I mean, that may be okay for the chattering classes, but most of the church does not consist of the chattering classes. And then sometimes the decisions have to be about discipline. You see, at the time of the Reformation, there was a lot of debate about the proper place for discipline in the church. And the reason for this was that many of the reformers had felt that the discipline of the medieval church was very burdensome. It did not encourage people to think about the freedom of the Christian person. But however, the Anglican tradition, as reflected in the homilies and also in the articles of religion, emphasized that in a healthy church, discipline has to be exercised. Has to be exercised. From time to time, in love, never only for the purpose of exclusion. I mean, for instance, any discipline of excommunication that may be exercised is for the purpose of repentance, so that the person being excluded can again be included. That is the burden of what St. Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 5. He is excluding someone because of their unrepentant sin. But then in 2 Corinthians he says, now you've done enough. Now you must bring the brother back in. But there has to be discipline and not neglect of it. And so many of our problems arise because the leaders themselves neglect discipline. So that is what true synodality must mean in a church. That is how the church needs to be gathered. Now, in such a gathering, of course, we have to ask, how is this to be structured? GAFCON 1 and 2 were great gatherings, as I've said, great enthusiasm, good teaching, great fellowship, but not enough structured. Well, maybe that can be excused in pioneering movements, but not for always. So what are we going to do? How are we going to structure our fellowship so that these gatherings are effective? And there are a number of things to be said here. First of all, we have to be clear that we are a confessing body of believers. I choose these words as carefully as I can, because sometimes it is said that Anglicanism is not confessional. Well, in one sense this is true. We sang Martin Luther's "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" this morning, but we don't have anything like the Augsburg Confession of Faith. We don't have anything even like the Westminster Confession. So Anglicanism is not confessional in the sense of the great Protestant confessions that emerged at the time of the Reformation. But that does not mean that it is not confessing. Anglicans, for example, are the most creedal church. We are constantly reciting the creeds or singing them or intoning them, as the case may be. The Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed. No other church, I don't think, uses the creeds as much as we do. And this is significant because this means a commitment to confessing the faith together. Confessing the faith together. So any future arrangements must be about that. A common confession of the faith. The Jerusalem Declaration is an attempt to do this. I think it is a very reasonable attempt. No one claims a perfection for it or the status of the Nicene Creed or whatever, of course not. But we need something that brings us together as people confessing the great truths of the Christian faith. Secondly, it's got to be conciliar. Now, of course, you can structure the councils of the church in a whole number of different ways, the genius of Anglicanism has been to bring together bishops, clergy, and laity in a common council. And we need to produce something like this if we are going to be effective. A common council of bishops, clergy, and lay people, but not one that is undifferentiated in the functions of everyone. In such a council, different sorts of people will have different responsibilities. Some will be concerned for finance and administration. Others will be concerned about the arrangements that need to be made for such a council. But there will be some who will have a special responsibility for stating the faith and the morals of the church. Our model can it not, the Council of Jerusalem itself. The whole church gathers. Peter and Paul explain to the council in Acts 15 what has happened. James then pronounces the decision on behalf of the apostles and elders. Elders, by the way, means presbyters, of course, as you know. The letter is then written to the Gentile churches about the decision made by the apostles and presbyters, and then the whole church decides how the letter is to be sent. Everybody is involved, but not everyone has the same task. So this kind of differentiated conciliarism is very important for us to discover, and not just to discover, but actually to enact if we are going to be effective. And the third word that I use sometimes is that these gatherings also have to be consistorial. This is a word often used both by Presbyterians and Roman Catholics, but there is a use for it in Anglicanism also. As a diocesan bishop, I had my consistory court. And that was for the sake of discipline in the church. That is to say, such gatherings will decide on questions of discipline, maybe not actual cases which may have to be decided at other levels and in other ways, but certainly to set out the broad principles by which discipline is to be exercised in the church. So, on the one hand, we regret very much the passing of the old instruments. But on the other hand, we are on the threshold and we have an opportunity to do something that is biblical, that is evangelical, that is Catholic, in having synodal ways of gathering, of praising, of praying, of deciding, of discipline. And we must do so if we are not to be reduced to impotence and constantly bewailing what has happened, but not doing anything constructive for the future, for the next generation and the generation after that. Having said that, of course, the institution is not all. The mission of the church is often not promoted by institutions, but by movements in the church that arise out of God's goodness and the work of the Holy Spirit. That is so, isn't it? Bishop Ray just mentioned Francis of Assisi and the Franciscan movement, the missionary societies I have mentioned. These were not institutional. They were not part of the synodal sort of superstructure of the church. But they are the people who have taken the gospel to where the gospel needed to be. And so we must pray and work for such movements, and what the institution must do is to make room for them, to encourage them to emerge, to bear witness to the gospel in the world, in our societies, to our nations, and even sometimes to those who have rule over us. On that point of how we are to relate to the state, to our societies, to the nation, to those who rule over us, if formal structures of, say, establishment in the Church of England, if their days are numbered, how are we to bear witness in these new situations where Christian faith is in different ways in different countries more and more at the margins and is being pushed to the margins? One of the things we cannot do is to excuse ourselves from responsibility for the nation as a whole in bearing witness to the gospel. We cannot withdraw into a kind of sectarian mood. And that's not true just of the nation, but of our communities, wherever we live. There has to be continuing engagement. I mean, you're not authentically church if you're not engaged in this missionary way with what is around you. But how are we to engage, especially where there is considerable hostility? Now, you will have many ideas about this, but I just want to say one or two things. I may have mentioned them in previous lectures, but just to bring them together. First of all, we have to contend for the faith in a non-coercive way. That is to say, when we argue our case in the public square, it must be based on the quality of our arguments and not status or privilege or whatever it may be. And this is not only perfectly possible to do, but eminently, Christians are eminently qualified to do this because of their worldview. So when we bring our view of the human person to society, when it is discussing, for example, abortion or euthanasia, well, that is much better than the kind of crudely utilitarian views that we find in the press or what we find in opinion polls or focus groups. Why are we backward in bringing such a view to public examination? Contending for the faith, but relying on the quality of our argument rather than status or privilege. Secondly, we may have to adopt campaigning styles to promote a Christian worldview. I mean, this may go against your temperament. Christians are humble people. I mean, that's good. Humility is a specifically Christian virtue, after all. But sometimes we need to organize, to campaign, to have our view heard when there are many different and very raucous voices sometimes being heard also. You have to get in edgeways. You have to keep your place in the debate and not be frightened off by it. It's not such a frightening place, actually, especially if you prepare well. And then thirdly, our opposition, where it has to be opposition, must be constructive and not merely seen even as destructive. It must be seen to be for the good of society, even by those who disagree with us, as coming from goodwill rather than ill will for our fellow citizens, for those who have authority in the land. Now, those are the sorts of things, I would say, a church that has renewed and reformed itself in the ways that I've suggested. Those are the ways in which it can effectively exercise its mission in the place where it has been set by God and for the good of His creation. Thank you very much indeed.